Okay. Well, very briefly, I've been, I'm telling you about the approach we had in the Netherlands this morning, so I will not repeat that. But maybe to take the perspective of a implementing contracting authority, and I can focus maybe a bit or zoom in on what we did as Piano to support the contracting authorities in the Netherlands. There are actually three, I think, choices you have to make when you implement the invoice. You need to make a choice on what is the technical solution that you will take there. What we did is we wrote a architectural guideline to inform you on what choices you have to make. And I think a lot of the elements that we had in our guideline I recognize in the framework that you have now here in Ireland. So that is common. It's important that you need to define what is the technical solution that I need. You need to have some kind of a vision on how do I approach this digital transformation in public procurement. So is it only the invoice, or is my end goal that we do full purchase to pay? So you need to have a view on what am I going to do beyond the invoice. If it's just the invoice, it's a small project. If you have a broader perspective and the end goal is a bigger digitalization in your purchasing unit, then it's better to have a view on that, to create some kind of roadmap, and then you can put the invoice on there. What we did in Piano is we created guidelines for such a roadmap, and we plotted the invoice on there, so helping them to do that thinking and implementing the invoice. And I think the last one would be, how do you want to engage your suppliers? That's connected to the question, what are you going to do with onboarding? Is it only about being compliant to legislation? Then you probably not have a very big ambition with your suppliers. But if you want to take this opportunity to improve your relation with your supplier, so for example, to shorten the period to the payment period, that's a way of improving your relation with your supplier, then you want to engage your supplier in this project. So you need to do something like onboarding, and what we did as Piano, we created a onboarding toolkit with, for example, a letter that you can send to your supplier, meetings that you can organize with your suppliers in your community. We have like a video that you can refer to with different types on how your supplier can send you the invoice. So I think those three elements, think of your IT infrastructure, think of your view or your vision on digitalizing the public procurement process, and think on how you're going to engage with your supplier. That were the key elements that we took up in the Netherlands. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Swedish example to contrast a bit how Ireland and Netherlands is working with voluntary adoption, or where you're not really mandating the suppliers by law to send electronic invoices, but that is happening in Sweden. So, see, looking back a bit, in Sweden we're working with an organization called Single Face to Industry, which is a joint organization which is promoting electronic business and e-invoicing. And it started already in the late 1990s. So we've been doing promotion of e-invoicing for 20 years. And it's not only invoicing, it's the whole procurement chain or the post-award procurement chain, particularly catalogs, orders, dispatch advice, and invoices. And lately also starting with electronic tendering and looking at that. All adoption of electronic business has been on a voluntary basis. We had a slow start, but some success stories. On the transposition of the directive, we have a law that now comes into effect on the 1st of April. From tradition, that's always the 1st of April or the 1st of July. That's how it works in Sweden. Our transposition makes it mandatory for suppliers to send electronic invoices. So it will be illegal to send a paper invoice. And there will be penalties if you do so, or if you're not complying to the standard. So we are taking this a step to more tough approach in that sense. And on we refer to the PEPL implementation of the European standard unless you have specific bilateral agreement with your suppliers. But you don't want to have that. We have 200,000 companies, and you don't want to have bilateral agreements on these technical aspects with all of them. So the current situation, now it's not 1st of April yet, but just looking at how it is now, is that all governmental authorities, all central authorities, are connected to PEPL and are already using e-invoicing. 95% of the municipalities and regions are using e-invoicing. For publicly owned companies, we don't know, because the publicly owned companies, if they fall under the Procurement Act, they're also relevant for this. We don't have any numbers for those, so that is the big unknown for us. PEPL must be supported, as I mentioned, for governmental authorities since 2018. There will be a mandate that all municipalities and the rest of the public sector must also be registered in PEPL as receivers by 1st of October. And for the actual, and currently 76% of the municipalities are registered. So we are measuring this, and what you see to the right, this is a list of all the municipalities. We have 250 approximately. And their PEPL ID, which I was talking about before. And you can see whether or not they are registered in PEPL yet. So this is being measured continuously. That's pretty much our situation. I can also say that from the support the required support has raised significantly. We've usually gets a handful of questions to the to the support group, a handful of questions a day, or sometimes no questions one day and then a handful the other day. Since the last 2 months, we are more or less drowning in support questions, because it's not only those that are interested, that are on voluntary basis with a long relationship with the customer. Now everybody must support this. And it's a big difference, especially with the small and all the misunderstandings that goes around, on what they really needs to do, both on the public and the private side. So we perhaps that we underestimated the necessary resources that would have to have this smoothly done from a support perspective. But I think that comes from the fact that it becomes mandatory to send, because then suddenly you're talking to hundreds of thousands of companies, and the requirement is not only on the receivers, which is more easier to handle. So, but on the other hand, now we will reach almost 100% electronic invoice more or less overnight. So we won't have to work with this onboarding and contacting suppliers and argue with them and explaining the benefits and all of that. Now we have that behind us. Now it will be mandatory, and it makes it much simpler to get this long tail of suppliers who just don't want to do electronic invoicing. So I think we will benefit from our investments in a higher degree than many other countries that rely on voluntary use. On the other hand, we have been doing this for 20 years, so there is a certain level of understanding and knowledge in the market, which makes it easier to go to mandatory. So I wouldn't recommend anybody going from nothing to mandatory overnight. So, yeah.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Martin. Michael Morgan again. I'm not going to go through all the slides here. I think in the interest of time and you getting to your lunch, it's important. But I'm just going to give a very quick the outcomes really of the project. So there's some project background which will be in the slides which you can read through. But just to give you the broad outline, it covers the ETBs, which is 750 schools and centres doing FET or further education in Ireland. Just give the broad scope of that. So that's really in terms of, and we wanted compliance, but we wanted to have an example of innovation, and we wanted in preparation for our own financial shared service in the education sector. So that was the motivation. So the makeup of the project, the background, I'll leave those for you to read through in terms of those. Did cover the 26 counties. Our implementation steps, I suppose I'll just cover that very briefly. We needed the access point to be set up. We had to define those policies, select a service provider. Again, you can use the framework now, so that should be easier for you to do. And we got live within 6 months of that. So the various checks, and there's some challenges in that. I'll cover those in the outcomes. So what were the outcomes that we wanted from the project so that we could actually deliver those? We have a website which is called eInvoicing.ie, and you're welcome to look at that. And that helps in terms of our onboarding. Again, like Martin said, we don't have an obligation, so this will explain to suppliers how you actually go about getting to be supplying e-invoices to the E2B sector. And there's a lot on there, and we'd be happy to discuss with you if you want anything around that. Myself and my colleague Bernie Toft here would be happy enough to talk you through that if you want to discuss that. One of our partners, again, is Pádraig Harty in the IT Sligo South Coordinator, and they actually have a MOOC, which is the Massive Open Online Course, which IT Sligo provide free of charge for people if they want to look at a little bit more depth in terms of their accounts payable or accounts receivable staff, in terms of getting certification on looking at e-invoicing, and also for IT personnel, if they want to go a bit more in depth, they can look at that as well. And that's a very good course to do. Our team would have all done that as well. It's very useful for you. In terms of where we were, a very brief summary, again, we're at 40,000 e-invoices we've received over the last two and a bit years. It's only 10% of the invoices because we're an interim shared service, so it's not covering the big area of those. But there are 100 live or tested suppliers, and again, our experience was it was actually easier to move with the smaller companies, because the larger companies tended to have a very long lead time in terms of getting them over the line over to e-invoicing, because they had other projects on, or they had awareness, or even the whole structure of the company was hard to move in terms of that was our experience anyway. So very brief into the summary. We did get live in 6 months. We were approved for the CEF funding, which was a competitive application in the country. We achieved our targets. We're over 100 suppliers now live. We have good feedback from suppliers, and there's case studies on the website if you want to have a look at that. The time and cost savings, particularly at the E2B school and centre, where they were actually inputting invoices on a laborious basis. The April 2019 deadline has been helpful in terms of the added incentive for suppliers, and the website has helped for the invoicing. But there were some challenges, and I suppose it's only fair to point those out. As an early mover, the awareness wasn't really there, so there was fairly high investment to get awareness across that, and hopefully that is a bit better for you. If you want to move to get a higher percentage, you can probably do that now. The change is sometimes difficult for organisations within that, so we're kind of starting out as a shared service, so for some of those organisations it is a bit of a challenge for them, because it's only was doing say 5 to 10%, and they still needed to do the other 90% in the same way. So the benefits sometimes aren't seen until you get to that tipping point in terms of volume, and that might be different for different organisations. And again, the long lead time for those is sometimes difficult. That's really all I wanted to cover in this. Thanks very much.